Holy Island. The tide is out, exposing broad areas of tidal flat, cut across by meandering tidal channels. Here, on the outer side of one of these meanders, the flowing water has steadily eroded away older deposits, laying bare the relatively young fossils of the animals that previously dwelt there.
There's quite a lot of bivalve shells here, stuck upright in the sediment with both the valves together. It seems that they've been preserved in life position, but we can confirm that by looking inside the shells. If I take one out and I open its valves and empty out some of the sediment that's inside, we can see here the embayment of the palleal line called the palleal sinus that corresponds to where the siphons projected from the top of the animal up towards the sediment surface to bring down water for feeding and gas exchange. So that's then exactly how this animal lived and died in its burrow in the sediment.
So now we know that the bivalves lived here. They weren't washed in from elsewhere. And that means that we can use what we know about their ecology to tell us something about the conditions in which the sediments were deposited. From living examples of the species, we can tell that the setting was marine, certainly not freshwater. These forms are also fairly sluggish burrowers and would not have tolerated rapid accumulation or removal of sediment. So the area was not subject to strong currents. It must have been pretty much as it is today, sheltered tidal flats.
So much for their life habits then, their ecology, but what about their death habits, so to speak, their taphonomy? How did these bivalves come to be preserved in life position in their burrows? Well, the answer may be this. About 20 centimetres or so above the bivalves is a hard layer over here formed by compacted mud and sand, forming this resistant cap to the flats. Now, this 20 centimetres would represent the original length of the siphons of the bivalves, and the coincidence of this hard cap at this level does rather suggest that the bivalves may indeed have been killed in their burrows as a result of the mud swamping the surface of the flats and literally suffocating the bivalves in their burrows, a sort of mass mortality event.
What we can be sure of, though, is that until the present tidal channel started to erode the deposit away, no later currents reworked the sediment, because the bivalve shells remained undisturbed in their burrows, further evidence for relatively quiet conditions. Also pointing to the lack of current reworking of the sandy sediment beneath the mud is the abundance of burrows made by other soft-bodied animals, such as worms and amphipods. In this area, then, the rate of biological disturbance of the sediment, bioturbation, has outweighed any effects of current reworking. The burrowers have had the last say. And today, the surface of the flats is littered with the evidence of their continuing labours. A stark contrast is presented by the sands of the more exposed shoreline to the north of Holy Island. Here the sediment shows well-preserved, gently dipping planar stratification, reflecting the regular seasonal reworking of the beach sands by wave swash. Vertical burrows produced by small amphipods at the back of the beach are the only potential trace fossils remaining. Here then, the currents have had the upper hand in imposing their signature on the sediments. Despite the abundance of burrowers, recorded only by their shells, washed out and left in the strand lines. Such observations in sedimentary environments today can give us clues for interpreting ancient sedimentary environments by uniformitarian analogy. Let's now take a look at the sedimentary rocks of Carboniferous age exposed along the Northumbrian coast, and we'll see what we can infer from the fossils and sediments present about the conditions in which their deposition took place. As with the sediments at Holy Island, we'll be looking at both body fossils, such as brachiopod shells, and trace fossils, like this trail here, and paying attention both to how the organisms lived and what happened to them when they died, their paleoecology and their taphonomy. The rocks range from limestones through shales to sandstones, with some thin coals, reflecting a variety of different depositional environments.
I'll start with one of the limestones. This one here contains a number of lengths of crinoid stem. Clearly these were broken up and transported prior to burial, but what's quite striking about them is the length of the pieces. They consist of numerous ossicles still stacked together. This means that the soft tissue that originally held the ossicles together can hardly have rotted at all. It's quite likely then that the living crinoids were torn apart by the same storm currents which later inundated them in sediment. Whatever was the case, this must have been a fairly rapid little pulse of sedimentation in what were generally quieter conditions. In this exposure of limestone, there are a number of thin interbeds of dark mudstone. Now, by looking at the way the fossils are preserved, we can get a good idea of the relative rates of deposition of the mudstone and the limestone. The upper surface of this limestone bed has a number of complete coral colonies which are preserved in life position, sitting on top of the bed of limestone. It is, if you like, a buried sea floor. Now, for them to have grown here, the deposition must have been relatively slow. Conditions must have been quite quiet to allow this mud to settle here between them. However, the fact that the corals have been preserved intact, unbroken, suggests that they were buried very rapidly. What by? Well, by this layer of mud that we see down here. So this mud must have been swept in quite rapidly, burying the corals and protecting them from the destructive activities of scavengers, organisms that bore into the coral skeleton and weaken it, current activities and so on. Subsequently, however, things went quiet again because the lamination, the sedimentary lamination of the mudstone has been completely destroyed and it has a biota-bated texture. So combining these observations then, we can conclude that generally conditions were quite quiet, allowing the coral colonies to grow, but from time to time there were rapid influxes of mud which just swamped everything on the seafloor.
Another witness to the normally slow background accumulation of the muddy limestones is the trace fossil Zoophycos. This was produced by some soft-bodied creature that evidently mined the sediment around it in a systematic manner, presumably extracting organic detritus from it, leaving this diaphanous swirling trace behind. It was clearly not pressed for time as it worked its way through the muddy, organic-rich sediment.
above the limestones, the influxes of mud have become predominant, and so we have a succession of shaly mudstones. Gone now are these extensive coral colonies that we had in the limestones, but the fauna that we find in the shaly mudstones still testifies to a marine environment. So, for example, there are several thin layers here, shell legs effectively, of debris from, for example, crinoids.
Brachiopods, sometimes in life position, but sometimes washed out into shell carpets, show that the sea floor was still generally calm, but occasionally current swept. Bioturbation is also widespread. These are pyritized burrows, emphasizing the predominance of biological disturbance over current reworking of the sediments.
With the influx of fine sand and silt, the fossil content seems to fall off quite rapidly. In this exposure, for example, I can't see any body fossils at all. There are a few trace fossils, but they're just limited to certain levels. In fact, what we seem to see a number of packets of sediment which are sharply based and which pass from fine sandstone with hummocky cross-stratification at the bottom to burrowed tops. Clearly then, the pattern of sedimentation was episodic, with pulses of sediment being brought in, probably during storms, and then there were long quiet periods in between when the burrowing organisms could come down from the top and mine the top muddy layers of the sediment for food, giving us trace fossils such as chondrites here, this branching trace fossil, which reflect a systematic search for detrital food in the muddy sediment. In the overlying swaley cross-stratified sands, bioturbation becomes limited to just a few trails and burrows here and there. Clearly, wave action was becoming so frequent that very few burrowing organisms could leave their mark in the sediment. We must have been approaching fair weather wave base. I've come to the upper part of the sandstone, and here is a very striking sedimentary structure. You've seen it already, actually, on the beach at Holy Island. It's planar stratification. So here, this sand was being deposited in a beach setting.
A few trace fossils are visible on the surfaces of some of the sandstone beds, but these are only simple ridged trails made by organisms such as gastropods and worms.
This is the trace fossil produced by a deposit-feeding worm. As it moved through the sand, swallowing the sand and feeding on the organic material in the sand, it would then leave behind these balls of sand as it worked its way through the sediment. At the top of the sandstone, things get quite interesting. Here we have still the relic of current activity, but as we go up to about the last metre or so of the sandstone, it becomes much paler, quite well cemented at the top, and most importantly, all the current stratification has been completely destroyed. Bioturbation is back again. I wonder why.
This time, the perpetrators are plants, more specifically their roots. We're on land, albeit a swamp, and the supply of sand has ceased for the time being at this point, allowing trees to turn the upper layers of sand into a fossil soil, a paleosol.
That's not the end of the story. Here's a beautiful example of one of these paleosols with a lovely impression here of one of these roots in position. Now, let's have a look at what comes above. If I dig around under here, I can just find here a thin relic of a layer of coal. That's compacted fossil peat, which of course overlay the original soil. But immediately above that is this dark grey mudstone, which is absolutely packed full of skeletal fragments. Let's have a closer look to see what they are. In fact, almost all of them are the broken up fragments of crinoids, which must have been washed in from somewhere. So the marine influence is back. What was previously a land area has now been flooded by the sea. In this exposure, the crinoidal mudstone has been eroded out to give this deep cleft inside here. But what we're interested in is the limestone immediately above. The base of the limestone is almost like a shelly gravel with a lot of large fragments, again, of crinoids. But as we go upwards through the limestone, it becomes progressively finer, muddier, with smaller and more dispersed shell fragments. Now, what the implication of these observations is that down here, current activity was sufficiently frequent to prevent mud settling out. So effectively what we have is a coarse shelly lag deposit. Further up, however, conditions must have quietened down, allowing the mud to settle out and effectively to dilute the shell fragments. So the implication of that is that there has been a steady deepening of the sea as we go upwards, giving progressively quieter conditions.
And complex deposit feeding traces such as Zerphycos return. Above the limestones, we come to dark mudstones again, with a rich fossil marine fauna, including, for example, trilobites, brachiopods, and gastropods. So we're again in the deposits of somewhat deeper, quieter waters as a new cycle of sediment accumulation begins. Higher up in the succession of Carboniferous deposits, however, in the coal measures, we lose the open marine limestones and mudstones and find instead only river-deposited sands, muds, and coals. As before, stigmaria roots can be found penetrating the overbanked deposits.
Elsewhere, paleosols contain the horizontal roots of lycopod trees. This one evidently has been growing along a muddy layer sandwiched between rippled sandstones. And in thick beds of sandstone deposited in river channels, as in this fallen block here, we can sometimes find sizable lengths of the stems of these trees with their distinctive diamond-shaped markings which show where little scale-like leaves attached on the surface.
From such information, combining study of the fossils and the sedimentology, we can build up a picture of the coal swamps. A reconstructed ecosystem which itself leads on to implications concerning the geography and climate of the time.
So that concludes our tour of some of the Carboniferous sedimentary rocks of the Northumbrian coast. The approach I've been taking to interpreting the environments in which these sedimentary rocks were deposited is to combine observations of the sedimentology, which I can interpret by reference to modern sedimentary processes, combined with observations of the fossils, both the body fossils and the trace fossils, and in particular paying attention not only to what I know about the ecology of the organisms, but also thinking about the way in which the organisms have been preserved, their taphonomy.